now I feel like my job is done. I can just kind of get out of here, right? Thank you guys so much. So this is going to be a different kind of presentation. It's not a typical speech, not a typical keynote. As you mentioned, I'm a poet. And so how many of you here are familiar, raise your hand, with spoken word poetry? Raise your hand. Okay, decent amount, about half the group. So what we like to say about spoken word, we say spoken word is not like golf. And when we say that, we mean that typically when people, so I work with young people, and typically when they hear about poetry, they think it's boring and people sitting by a fire in the 17th century, and you sit there and you're listening and you go, hmm, and then you do the golf clap just like that. No, that's boring. We don't want to do that. So can everybody snap? Can I hear you snap? So if you like something, you snap, right? You can snap during the poem. We say if you really, really like something, you do what we call the delicious chocolate noise, which is when you go, mmm. Everybody go, mmm, mmm. And if you really, really like something, you do like Jesus, but like with a sh, because this is a secular space. And so it's like, Jesus, and you fall over on the person next to you, and like, you know, you just feel it. You're just emotionally captured. But like, please check with the person next to you before you fall on them. Some of y'all just met each other. We don't need any crazy stuff happening. But yeah, I'm super excited to be here and super excited to be in the room with so many people who are doing remarkable, remarkable work in Atlanta and across the country. And so I'm going to share with you through some poems my perspective as an educator, as a writer, as a researcher, some of the things I think we should all be keeping in mind when we are focused on changing communities. And so this first piece, I always like to start with because I think it really represents why I do the work that I do and what it means for us to speak into the silences that exist in the world around us. What does it mean for us to not be bystanders, but to be upstanders? And I think for so many of you who work in really specific sectors and really specific niches, it's really important for us to understand the sort of intersectionality of what change looks like, and that change doesn't happen in silos. That change doesn't just, that we can't fix mass incarceration without thinking about housing discrimination, that we can't fix food insecurity without thinking about the socio-historical context of poverty, and all of these things, all understanding that they're all interconnected, and that if we're going to truly create meaningful, sustainable change, that we have to be looking at the sort of totality of everything that has created the phenomenon in the first place. And so that means really making sure that we speak up even when something isn't necessarily ostensibly in our lane, so to speak. And so this is this piece. As a kid in a Catholic family in New Orleans, during Lent, I was always taught that the most meaningful thing one could do was to give something up. Sacrifice something you typically indulge in to prove to God you understand his sanctity. I've given up soda, McDonald's, French fries, French kisses, and everything in between. But one year, I gave up speaking. Figured the most valuable thing I could sacrifice was my own voice, but it was like I hadn't realized that I had given that up a long time ago. I've spent so much of my life telling people the things they wanted to hear instead of the things they needed to. Told myself I wasn't meant to be anyone's conscience because I still had to figure out being my own, so sometimes I just wouldn't say anything, appeasing ignorance with my silence, unaware that validation doesn't need words to endorse its existence. When Christian was beat up for being gay, I put my hands in my pocket and walked with my head down as if I didn't even notice. Couldn't use my locker for weeks because the bolt on the lock reminded me of the one I had put on my lips when the homeless man on the corner looked at me with eyes up, merely searching for an affirmation that he was worth seeing. I was more concerned with touching the screen of my Apple than actually feeding him one. When the woman at the fundraising gala said, "I'm so proud of you. It must be so hard teaching those poor, unintelligent kids," I bit my lip because apparently we needed her money. One of my students needed their dignity. We spend so much time listening to the things people are saying that we rarely pay attention to the things they don't. Silence is the residue of fear. It is feeling your flaws, gut-wrench guillotine your tongue. It is the air retreating from your chest because it doesn't feel safe in your lungs. Silence is Rwandan genocide. Silence is Katrina. It is what you hear when there aren't enough body bags left. It is the sound after the noose is already tied. It is charring. It is chains. It is privilege. It is pain. There is no time to pick your battles when your battles have already picked you. I will not let silence wrap itself around my indecision. I will tell Christian that he is a lion, a sanctuary of bravery and brilliance. I will ask that homeless man what his name is and how his day was, because sometimes all people want to be is human. I will tell that woman that my students can talk about transcendentalism like their last name was Thoreau. And just because you watch one episode of The Wire doesn't mean you know anything about my kids. So this year, instead of giving something up, I will live every day as if there were a microphone tucked under my tongue, a stage on the underside of my inhibition. Because who has to have a soapbox when all you've ever needed is your voice? And so people always get confused. They're like, I saw some people snapping and then other people clapping. They're like, what do I do? So you can clap after the poem, and during the poem is snap, right? It's always a little bit confusing. And so when I think about change, when I think about what it means to engage in community-based and community-centered change, I think about how many stakeholders there are who are invested in what that looks like. And I think so often, because there's so many smart people and so many leaders in the community here, and who have brilliant, brilliant ideas, we can sometimes get consumed in the sort of notion that we always feel like we know what the best thing to do is. And I think sometimes we have to step back and step outside of ourselves and realize that the most important thing we can do is listen. And that the most important thing we can do is listen to the other stakeholders, listen to the people. And so when I think of my job, when I think of as an educator, I think of parents, right? And I think sometimes teachers come in and we're told, like, we have to solve the achievement gap, we have to get rid of poverty, and we're like, here we go, we put our cape on, we're ready to go. And we forget about the people who've been in those communities for generations, who've been doing this work on behalf of the community, and who we could really learn from, and who are as invested in the well-being of the community and as in the kids as we are, if not, certainly not more, because these are their children. And so when I think of that, I think of my own father, and it's forced me to sort of reflect on my relationship with him. And 2 years ago, he had his second kidney transplant. And so throughout my entire adolescent and adult life, my father had chronic kidney disease. And during his second kidney transplant, there were a lot of complications with the surgery, and we weren't sure if he was going to make it. And I think it really pushed me to again, step back and say, like, who is this man in my life, and like, how has he shaped me? And I think part of what that did was really decouple what it means to be the idea of like schooling versus education, right? And that I've been schooled for, from K-12 for 13 years, and then college and then graduate school. But the best educator in my life was my father. Right? And that's something that can't be replaced. And so it really pushed me to look back and see, who was this man? And anytime I think any of us are confronted with the mortality of a loved one in a way that we haven't necessarily thought about before, it really pushes us to reflect on who they are and how they've shaped how all of us navigate and operate in this world. And so this piece is for him. In New Orleans, seafood is as much a part of life as changing tides. I was raised between shrimp etouffee and fried catfish, learned to walk on crab legs, and was baptized in a pot of crawfish before I even knew what one was. Still, I was always disgusted by the oysters. But see, my dad loved them. He said that the zinc in the meat was good for your hair, and that if I had seen the hairlines on the men on my mama's side of the family, I'd better start eating up. I would later learn that an oyster's pearls were formed from foreign parasites that had breached the boundaries of its shell. To protect itself from the danger, the oyster cocoons the substance in coats of calcium until the very thing that was trying to destroy it becomes the thing that makes it most beautiful. Mother Nature has a funny way of teaching us. See, last summer while visiting home, I went to check on my dad to see if he knew the score of the game, but when I opened the door to his bedroom, I saw him laying on the ground like a broken promise, genuflecting in front of a prayer. My father held his stomach as if he had been stabbed by the very person entrusted to protect him. Betrayal has never been so silent. There is no treason like that of your own body turning against itself. A Benedict Arnold with a bayonet in your bloodstream. A Judas kissing your kidneys goodbye for 30 pieces of silver. See, chronic kidney disease is deep sea diving with no oxygen, drowning underwater, waiting for a transplant to bring you back to the surface. But my father is an oyster, wears a shell hardened by growing up in a place where expectations never rose above low tide, has a coral reef of a mother with the echo of an unborn ocean on her breath, taught him that when the waves of this world try to wear you down, it's okay. We are all just a little bit weathered, and she has taught me that if an oyster can turn a parasite into a pearl, then it is no surprise that my father can turn a kidney into calligraphy. See, when I was 14 and he was first diagnosed, he wrote me a 15-page letter saying that if anything happened, I had to be ready to become the man of the house, he wrote Clint. Though it hasn't always looked like it, I've always put God first. I know you complain because Clinton Ward Smith III makes it sound like you're the heir to a British monarchy, but never doubt you are a king. Understand that I gave you your grandfather's name because the most sacred things I have ever known come in trinities. Clint, love your mother like a stained glass window in a war zone. She can be both shield and shard, both weapon and protection. Treat every woman like you would want a man to treat your sister. This ocean already has enough sharks. Clint, don't be another shark. My father is an oyster. Clasped down tightly on the things he loves the most, his family and his God. He has a calcium-encrusted heart cradled tightly in his chest. Bears scars worn from waves that have tried to erode him of this world. My father is an oyster. And I pray that when he is pulled from this ocean, that those who live above the surface will see the brilliance of his pearls. And so my dad I'm from New Orleans, and my dad is your kind of prototypical, like, strong, silent Southern man. And my mom is like the nurturing, loving, prototypical Southern woman. And so whenever I got like an A on a test, or I like scored a goal or made a basket in the game, I'd always run up to mom and be like, Mom, look, I got an A, or I scored a goal. She'd be like, coochie, coochie, coo, I love you, mwah, mwah, mwah. And it was great. And I would go and tell my dad, I'd be like, Dad, I got an A, I scored a goal. And he would walk up to me, and he'd like turn me around, slap me on the butt, and be like, good job, boy. And I'd be like, okay, people show love in different ways, that's cool, all right. And so we were in the hospital, and it was my mother, my father, my younger sister, and my younger brother. And this was Christmas Eve 2013 at Johns Hopkins Hospital. And I'd just written this piece, and we were all in the room, and I shared it. And I've been fortunate to perform and read poems in some incredible places all across the world, but this was the most moving, personally moving experience of reading a poem and sharing a piece for myself. And we were in the room, and I shared it, and everybody started crying. My mom, my sister, my brother, me. It was emotional. My mom ran over, and she held me, coochie, coochie, coo, I love you. And my dad, like, got up out of the hospital bed, and he walked over to me, and he was like, good job, boy. And I was like, oh, Dad, come on, man. I was like, this was the moment. But I love him anyway. He shows love, and I appreciate him. And I appreciate him in part because I recognize how difficult his job was. And I think for me, part of what has illuminated how difficult his job was so much of what has happened over the course of the past year with this sort of illumination of state-sanctioned violence against black men and black women across this country. My father raised me to be acutely aware of my racial identity in a way that I didn't always understand, and in a way that I was often frustrated by, because I grew up in a very heterogeneous, mixed race, socioeconomic community, and I had friends kind of every color of the rainbow, and I couldn't understand why he would tell me that I couldn't do certain things that my other friends could do. I didn't understand why he would tell me that I couldn't run around the neighborhood at nighttime, when like all my other friends did it and never would run across people's lawns, jump over fences, and like it was nothing. And he was like, you can't do that. Like, you're not the same as you don't have the opportunity to do that. And I was a kid, and I didn't understand. And I remember when Tamir Rice was killed, the young man, the child, the 12-year-old boy in Cleveland, Ohio, who was shot by police within 2 seconds of them pulling up while he was playing with a toy gun in a park. And it brought back, for me, a very sort of visceral moment with my father, in which we were on a field trip, and he had a conversation with me about playing with water guns. And I didn't understand at that point, and I was resentful of him. I was resentful, I was embarrassed, I was ashamed that my dad was the strict dad, that my dad was like not letting me do all of the things that my other friends got to do. But in that moment, I think I understood in a better way than I ever had. And so what I've been thinking a lot about over the course of the past year is the sort of pedagogy of black parenting, and like how black parents have to raise their children in categorically different ways than white parents just to keep them alive. And like how difficult of a decision must that be for a parent to like strip away parts of a child's childhood in an effort to make sure that they come home at night. And I think it's something to really reckon with, and it's something that I've had to reckon with a lot this past year, and this poem is a reflection on that conversation and sort of the larger principles under which my parents raised me. One night when I was 12 years old, on an overnight field trip to another city. My friends and I bought super soakers and turned the hotel parking lot into our own water-filled battle zone. We hid behind cars, running through the darkness that lay between the streetlights. Boundless laughter ubiquitous across the pavement. But within 10 minutes, my father came outside, grabbed me by my forearm, and led me into our room with an unfamiliar grip. Before I could say anything, tell him how foolish he made me look in front of my friends, he derided me for being so naive, looked me in the eye, fear consuming his face, and said, "Son, I'm sorry, but you can't act the same as your white friends. You can't pretend to shoot guns. You can't run around in the dark. You can't hide behind anything other than your own teeth." I know now how scared he must have been, how easily I could have fallen into the empty of the night, that some man would mistake this water for a good reason to wash all of this away. These are the sorts of messages I've been inundated with my entire life. Always keep your hands where they can see them. Don't move too quickly. Take off your hood when the sun goes down. My parents raised me and my siblings in an armor of advice, an ocean of alarm bells so someone wouldn't steal the breath from our lungs, so that they wouldn't make a memory of this skin, so that we could be kids, not casket or concrete. And it's not because they thought it would make us better than anyone else. It's simply because they wanted to keep us alive. All of my black friends were raised with the same message, the talk, given to us when we became old enough to be mistaken for a nail ready to be hammered to the ground, when people made our melanin synonymous with something to be feared. But what does it do to a child to grow up knowing that you cannot simply be a child, that the whims of adolescence are too dangerous for your breath, that you cannot simply be curious, you are not afforded the luxury of making a mistake, that someone's implicit bias might be the reason you don't wake up in the morning? But this cannot be what defines us. Because we had parents who raised us to understand that our bodies weren't meant for the backside of a bullet, but for flying kites and jumping rope and laughing until our stomachs burst. We had teachers who taught us how to raise our hands in class and not just to signal surrender, and that the only thing we should give up is the idea that we aren't worthy of this world. So when we say that Black lives matter, it's not because others don't. It's simply because we must affirm that we are worthy of existing without fear, when there are so many things that tell us we are not. I want to live in a world where my son will not be presumed guilty the moment he is born, where a toy in his hand isn't mistaken for anything other than a toy. And I refuse to accept that we can't build this world into something new, some place where a child's name doesn't have to be written on a t-shirt or a tombstone, where the value of someone's life isn't determined by anything other than the fact that they had lungs. A place where every single one of us can breathe. And so, thinking about that, I think part of what's most important as an educator and as someone and as all of you who are interested in sort of problem solving in communities in need, is for us to, again, think about the sort of socio-historical and socio-political context that shapes the realities of these communities. And so for me, when I first started teaching in Prince George's County, Maryland, right outside of DC, it was the first time that I was confronted with the sort of, again, this intersectionality of how deeply tied together all of the social phenomenon that were happening in my children's community, my students' community was. And so when I was there, I was forced to think about how all of these things happening in my kids' lives before they ever step foot inside of a classroom affect what they're going to be able to do when they're inside of the classroom. And that it will be disingenuous of me and naive of me as a teacher to sit there and say, okay, we're going to study Thoreau, we're going to study Shakespeare, we're going to study Toni Morrison and Baldwin, and like just don't worry about things that have been happening outside of these walls. Don't worry, because that's just not how the world works. And that's not, I think a lot of people, we sort of create this idea that we have to have high expectations for our students as if that means we have to ignore the reality from which the students are coming. And I think that's a false choice, right? We can have high expectations for people without dismissing the sort of destructive realities from which they are coming. And also recognizing that these realities from which they're coming aren't a result of it being their fault, right? Like it's not a child's fault that they grow up in poverty. It is not a child's fault that they grow up not knowing where they're going to get their next meal. It's not a child's fault that they grow up in a community where police are taught to see them as monsters as opposed to children. And so really thinking about that, and one of the phenomenon that was became most evident to me was the idea of food insecurity. And so Prince George's County is labeled by the U.S. Department of Agriculture as a food desert. And I had never heard the language of food desert before until I started teaching there. And I realized like that, there were no grocery stores within miles of where my school was. And so that my kids were coming to school every morning eating hot Cheetos and honey buns and Coke, not because that was the thing they wanted to do, because they had no choice, right? And so again, it's like sometimes we conflate what is happening in a child's life or in a community, and we say, oh, these people, they just don't want to do this, or this is like a cultural thing, or this is actually like these so many cultural phenomena are the result of like structural and systemic realities. And I think it's super important to keep that in mind. It's something that I had to hold myself accountable to when I was teaching. And so this next piece is a reflection on the idea of food insecurity and how deeply it affected my students' lives every day. As a child, my father would tell me stories of ancient Egyptian warriors, traveling for endless days and nights across infinite desert plains, showing signs of endurance and bravery I could only dream of emulating. He would tell me that upon their return home, these warriors would be welcomed with a feast worthy of their bravery on the battlefield. Years later, as a teacher in Greater Washington, D.C., I too now find myself traversing a desert, though it is not the one I envisioned. A food desert. It's categorized as a poor urban area where residents cannot afford or are not given access to healthy foods and grocery stores. Every day at 2:45, I watch my students hop onto this leaking submarine of a school bus, every block bringing them deeper into an ocean where the only fish they find are fried, where fruits and vegetables are playing an everlasting game of hide and go seek because there are no grocery stores here. Just liquor stores and Popeyes, Dunkin' Donuts and 7-Elevens, children born into a neighborhood that feels more pollution than solution. It is then I realize that I am not too far from the deserts I once dreamed of. See, whether Anacostia or the Sahara, it doesn't make much difference because to these grocery stores, Southeast DC is no different than the Serengeti to them. Brown-skinned little boys like my students are nothing more than walking cacti, just a piece of scenery this world has taught everyone to stay away from. Brianna literally has a landfill in her backyard, so she has a hard time convincing herself the world doesn't just think she's trash. Restaurants come and dump the remains of food she'll never be able to afford to eat 3 steps from her back door. Jose eats fast food 5 days a week because his mother works 3 jobs to take care of 6 kids and only sees her son when she arrives home from work at the same time he's leaving for school. He has gotten so big that the excess fat bunker beneath his skin puts added pressure on his joints. His knees are literally crumbling under the weight of this world. Olivia watched her father shot 2 feet from her front porch. She wants nothing more than to go outside and play at the park after school, but gun violence has made a merry-go-round feel more like Russian roulette, so she doesn't go outside. Simply eats any processed food from the cabinet that will last long enough to prevent her from leaving the house too often. These are my students, my warriors, fighting a battle against an enemy they cannot clearly see. These kings and queens meant to feast, not to fester, but their zip code has already told them that their life expectancies are 30 years shorter than the county 7 miles away. I can see the faults of my own ancestry shaking in their eyes. Diabetes and high blood pressure run through the roots of my family tree. Heart disease is as much a part of my history as shackles and segregation. So from my father's kidney transplant to Olivia's asthma, these things are more than mere coincidence. Both grew up in places more accustomed to gunshots than gardens, so tell me place doesn't matter. That the neighborhoods that are predominantly healthy aren't the same ones that are predominantly wealthy. When you're not choosing between buying your medicine and your groceries, health doesn't have to be a luxury. It doesn't have to be an abstract concept presented in academic journals and policy briefs. My students overcome more every day than I will in my lifetime. They are the roses that grew from the concrete, the budding oasis in the heart of the desert, and their lives are worth far much more than the things that this world has fed them. So I know you guys have some incredible speakers tonight, and I'm excited to hear them. So I'm going to end on one last poem, and I think I always like to end on this one because it's really important. I talk a lot about systemic and structural realities that shape the lives of poor communities and communities of color, the communities that I come from, and the communities where I teach and where I work. But I think it's really important for us not to conflate the community and the people in the community with the structural realities of the community themselves, right? Because I think sometimes we can go in really well-intentioned and say, like, we are here to, like, implicitly say, we are here to fix the people in these communities. When in fact, there's nothing wrong with the people in their communities. The problem is the communities from which these people are coming, and the sort of, like, large history and the centuries and centuries of discrimination and prejudice and, like, public policy that has shaped what these communities look like. That's what we need to try and fix, right? We're not fixing people, we're fixing communities and the structures so that we can allow people to have an opportunity to flourish and live as if any of us would love to live our own lives. And so I always like to end on this piece and just ensure that we're having conversations, and when we talk about the work we do, that we're making sure we're having asset-based conversations rather than deficit-based, and that we're making sure that we're talking about the best in people instead of the worst. When the world thinks about my students, too often they see caricatures of pity, metaphors of misery that can do nothing for themselves. But every day I see resilience. I see boys and girls turn into young men and women right in front of my face. I see students who walk to school on street corners where policemen can make them feel more terror than talent, but they still show up for tutoring at 6:30 in the morning. So often we focus so much on the quicksand that we fail to see what has refused to drown. So when you think about my kids, don't just think about what holds them down. Think about how they overcome it every day. Think of Janiyah, who turns my classroom into a coliseum. Every word she speaks coded in creativity. Her poetry would have brought Homer to his feet. Think of Anna, who became an honor roll student when the world wanted to free and reduce lunch to find her. She is more than a form. She is more than a number. Think of Chris, who has been working every day since he was 13. That money helps his mother keep the lights on so that their world isn't covered in darkness. My students have turned my classroom into a symphony of second chances. Every day we write to right the wrongs that have been done to communities that never had a choice. We read to learn how to tell our own stories, because no one can define who we are if we are the ones holding the dictionary. So don't tell me my kids aren't brilliant. Don't tell me that they aren't walking miracle. My students have taught me how to relearn every part of me. I carry their stories like a back pocket full of prayer, and I leave my classroom a better person every day. So when we speak of them, let us speak of humanity. Let us speak of perseverance. Let us speak of how funny they are. Let us speak of how courageous they are. Let us not focus so much on the shadow that we fail to see what stands above it. Let us celebrate the best of our kids, as we would want anyone to celebrate the best of us. Thank you all so much. Appreciate it.